A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations.
War. War never changes. Because it can't. Because we won't let it. War is for the good of our bottom line. It's war that lines the pockets of our elites and stops the poor from getting any big ideas. War will take them all. Our poor will find their end fighting for our profits. And the enemy's poor will die fighting ours instead of fighting us. That's the cycle of violence that keeps America great. And that's why the House always wins. The Pinkos don't want war. That's what makes them so bad at it. Even if the bombs were to fall tomorrow, the American dream will never die. There will always be someone, many someones, fighting new ways to profit, new ways to wage war. After all, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
On the 17th of January, 1961, President of the United States of America, Dwight D. Eisenhower, appeared on national television to give his farewell address. Rather than use his final message to reflect on his successes and failures, he used his limited time to issue a warning that was deeply necessary, and a warning that was completely ignored. For many people around the world, this was the first time they had ever heard about the monster overtaking the American state, one whose power was growing exponentially since World War II. It was, however, apparently too little, too late.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
By the time Eisenhower made his final address, the military-industrial complex and the United States government were all but indistinguishable, and it only got more blurry from there. No one heeded Ike's warning. From World War II onwards, and more as the Cold War waged on and on into the decades since, the line between Halliburton and the White House, between Raytheon and Washington, was no line at all. It was a revolving door. And the door continues to spin to this day. It is thanks to men like Vannevar Bush, the founder of weapons giant Raytheon and the Manhattan Project both, who built weapons of mass death and profited from them. to Dick Cheney, formerly of Halliburton, to whom he granted sweetheart contracts to administer the oil industry in Iraq, once Cheney had razed it to the ground, to Eric Prince, the CEO of Blackwater and collaborator with both the CIA and the Trump administration, through which the military-industrial complex continues its meat-grinding operations. Bodies go in, money goes out. First the World War, then the Cold War, then the Project for a New American Century, and the War on Terror. War is good for business. War is the engine of American domination, of cultural hegemony. War never changes. And now, please welcome your host for the evening, Monroe Doctrine. Oh shit, am I on? Yes, thank you. My name is Monroe Doctrine, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all, my fellow Americans, to this very special show, the first of its kind, on a brand new channel we like to call NPR. That stands for No Pinkos Radio. Unfortunately, this whole Cold War disaster is the reason why I'm not standing before you smoking one of my beloved cigarettes. I was told that my longest relationship, and between you and me, the only one with any sparks, with the good people at Marlboro Cigarettes, had to come to an end. You see, apparently Marlboro Reds sounded a little too Soviet, so me and my producers are working on coming up with a new and equally carcinogenic sponsor. Our friend Zoe at some old redcoat paper, the Daily Telegraph, sent over a packet of freedom fags. Apparently that word means something different over there. If I'm honest, it wouldn't be the first time I've had one in my mouth, however. Actually, Daniel, can you cut that? If the FBI is listening, they're going to put me on a list. Anyway, today I'm here to talk to you about something as American as apple pie. That's right, it's war. Specifically, the military-industrial complex, and how its history is mirrored in the television series Fallout, based on the video game series with the same name, world, and themes. Now, you might be thinking, how can a science fiction series about a post-nuclear hellscape possibly have anything to do with the real world? We're all still here. Well, what if I told you that a lot of the things that seemed most outlandish in the show are quite close to real people and events, and that we ourselves have been seconds from nuclear winter on multiple occasions? In fact, it's stranger than that, you see. The good folks in the military-industrial complex had plans in place not that dissimilar to those of Vault-Tec. After all, what better way to ensure the American dream wins than to destroy the ability of the rest of the world to dream at all, even if it means nuclear winter? After all, how does the old saying go? Ah, yes, of course. Better dead than red.
Death is a preferable alternative to communism.
Okay, you caught me. It's me, Brigitte Empire. I wasn't an old-timey American radio host, despite how incredibly convincing that accent was. It was me, all along, science and culture correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, and I'm not apologising for that accent, because after researching this video, if anything, people need to be making fun of Americans more. Plus, my grandma was from New York, so I'm allowed to do it. Speaking of America, though, I watched Fallout, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. I'm a huge fan of the games already, but the show hit every note I could possibly have wanted. Amazing characters, fantastic and heart-wrenching plot and world building, because you can't really untangle them in this case, and a story of corporate political intrigue that a few of you might be watching this thinking, oh come on, that stuff was completely unbelievable. Well, you know what they say, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. And in this case, the most comic book villain level plots in the show are the parts most grounded in real world history. And we're going to get to that. But first, for those of you unfamiliar with the world of Fallout, or the show in particular, a brief catch-up. Then we'll get up to the themes of the show and how they parallel the very real stories of 20th century America, and the horrifyingly apocalyptic potential of the military-industrial complex that is completely inseparable from the American state to this very day.
So it's to hold up your thumb just like this. And if the cloud is smaller than your thumb, now you run for the hills.
And if it's bigger than your thumb?
They told us not to bother running.
The first Fallout game came out in 1997, in the strange middle period in Western history between the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the War on Terror, a point where, for all intents and purposes, the United States of America had achieved complete cultural victory over the entire world. Socialism, communism, even social democracy for the most part, was out. Liberal capitalism was the winner. And we all had to accept that from now until the end of time, nothing could ever change. Human society had reached its final stage. As economist and political scientist Francis Fukuyama put it, it was the end of history. He has since eaten his words. In fact, one of the main architects of the War on Terror was Halliburton's very own Dick Cheney, who also, not coincidentally, was one of the authors of the Project for a New American Century, which is something that if you know anything about, the scenes that make up the Vault-Tec conspiracy arc of the Fallout TV show will look alarmingly familiar.
A nuclear event would be a tragedy, but also an opportunity. Perhaps the greatest opportunity in history, because when we are the only ones left, there will be no one to fight. A true monopoly.
Still, it's pretty interesting that a game that came out in between the Cold War and the subsequent lashing out and eventual death throes of the American Empire drew so much from the Cold War to make its world. A satire of American nationalism, the Red Scare, the horror of how close the world was brought to nuclear war on the whims of the revolving door between defense contractors and the US government. It all worked. And I'm not exaggerating when I talk about the revolving door here. Vannevar Bush, the founder of the weapons giant Raytheon, was instrumental in persuading the United States to develop the nuclear bomb. He headed the Manhattan Project and insisted on both the need for these weapons and the need for the US to be the ones to develop and stockpile them, while making a, if you pardon the pun, killing from the military. As Alexander Zaitchik wrote for Salon in 2013. The roots of autumn 83, following the Cuban Missile Crisis, and two further nuclear close calls, are deep and tangled, but it's enough to trace them back to the détente administrations of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. It was during this period of relatively slick Cold War tension that an opposition formed the intellectual strategic foundations of détente, a recognition and acceptance of nuclear stalemate, of Russian parity, of deterrence, and mutually assured destruction. This opposition was built around three men: the veteran defense official Paul Nitze, the physicist Edward Teller, and the academic strategist Albert Wohlstetter. They established a camp on the margins of the defense debate that rejected the view that nuclear weapons could prevent a superpower conflict, not triumph in one. They found early acolytes and enablers among some familiar names: Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pele, and Donald Rumsfeld. It was businessmen who would both persuade the government to arm themselves further and further, and then get some of their own into government so that they could be those decision makers themselves who made sure that nuclear war was always, always on the table. Without that threat, where was their profit? For the sake of their bottom line, they created a world where people lived in fear, where people would need weapons, would need shelters, would need Raytheon and Halliburton and their fellow travelers. A world where nuclear Armageddon was a constant threat. For Vannevar Bush and his friends in Raytheon, and for those that would follow him in what we now call the military-industrial complex, like Halliburton's favourite son Dick Cheney, this state of looming apocalypse was, ultimately, good for business. Those of you that have seen the Fallout TV show might have started to see what I'm getting at here. More on that later, because even the Vault systems, the plans for absolute US domination at any cost, plans for nuclear war on countries throughout the world, plans directly from American defense contractors and government officials to nuke China, and the idea that American capitalism would recover from a nuclear winter in just a few months, that's all, unfortunately, quite real. But the world of Fallout is, thankfully, not. And the layers of abstraction it uses make it a really useful lens for satire. Even if the world went to complete shit in the exact ways the series outlines, it would never look like Fallout. and that's precisely because of its retro-futuristic setting. The blend of 1950s American pastiche and technology based around vacuum tubes, nuclear reactors, and robots voiced by Matt Berry.
I thought I was here to be a sex slave.
What? No! What a disgusting idea! I'm simply going to harvest your organs.
The Fallout series is set following nuclear Armageddon in the future of an alternate past. That sounds more confusing than it is. Anyway, for the most part, gameplay takes the form of doing your regular RPG or action RPG, doing quests, fighting monsters and human factions both, and discovering a plot centered around political intrigue between the factions, all determined to decide the future of the long-since ended world on their own terms, around a post-nuclear United States. In the majority of the entries in the series, you take on the role of a vault dweller. You and your ancestors having been hidden away in elaborate underground bunkers with sinister hidden purposes, since the double-headed snake of Vault Tech and the American government profited their way towards, and then possibly enacted, nuclear Armageddon. Now, Fallout shelters were built across America in real life. There are 10,000 known shelters in New York City alone, but for the most part, the United States didn't want to build them for you. These were for the most part repurposed public buildings. Instead of building them for you then, they wanted to sell them to you, or for you to build one yourself. They were, of course, not communists. Wasn't that what all of this was about? This is the whole point of the war. If the bombs were to fall, they would fall on Americans, goddammit, and they would find them unkillable. In fact, wait, was that about the Cold War or about now? Because I don't know if you've been seeing this, but America's billionaires have been buying up and renovating old Cold War bunkers. You know, to wait out the climate apocalypse they're actively causing. But back in the Cold War, at the same time as they were spending billions building up stockpiles of weapons that would make nuclear winter damn near inevitable, the US government spent $1.7 billion in today's money on the country's fallout shelters. They even encouraged the average American to have a chance to become part of the new generation of nuclear-age entrepreneurs, staking out uranium for your country, making a tidy profit off the very thing that will lead to the demise of you and everyone you love. The American dream made manifest. There was even a board game about this, fun for the whole family. But while America splashed out money to build shelters, they did not provide them for the public. In true American style, there was instead a nationwide boom in the construction of underground, privately funded fallout shelters located on citizens' property, as Wes O'Donnell writes in Medium. So, you might be asking, where did all this money go? You know, the $1.7 billion. Who were all those shelters for? Well, the US government, of course, saw fit to build state-of-the-art vaults for high-ranking members of staff, which of course included those with long histories of working for the government's favourite children, the military contractors. These continuity of government facilities, as they became known, are still around, and in fact Dick Cheney, a name coming up again and again in this video, was involved in this very program in the transition from the Cold War to the War on Terror, the new frontier for profiteering for American arms dealers, because peace is bad for business.
Basically, they carved out a city underground that could survive a direct hit from a nuclear blast. After you go through the security, you walk in and it's basically an underground tunnel. There's a blast door that was 3.5 foot thick that weighed 30 tons. You go through like an airlock, and they had 2 of those doors, and then you walk another half a mile.
A half mile deeper into the mountain is the bunker itself.
And you're going past 5 buildings. Those represent the 5 rings of the Pentagon. And each of those buildings are 3 stories tall, and they probably have 50 to 80 offices per floor.
The buildings are mounted on springs to survive the shock waves from a nuclear blast.
There's a common cafeteria capable of serving 3,000 people 3 meals a day for 30 days on lockdown. They had a barbershop in there with 1 chair.
It's got massive reservoirs, generators, even a crematorium if needed, post office, medical facilities, and emergency command and communication links to the US military all around the world.
Again, if you watch the Fallout show, you'll see the parallels. Quoting Radley Garrett in an interview with Newsweek, "You essentially had these 2 competing models," Garrett said. The socialist model, embraced not just by the Soviet Union, but also Scandinavia, involved massive investment in the creation of government installations that preserves the lives of citizens. He continued, "In more free market-inclined countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, bunkers were built for politicians, for elites, for wealthy people in positions of power. There was very little provision made for the general public." In fact, for those of you who know your Fallout lore and your American history both, you probably see the parallels between the most important and extensive of these underground facilities, the US's Continuity of Government program, and the plans of the Enclave, the continuation of the American state in the Fallout games. In the Fallout canon, the Enclave is a faction of high-ranking military, political, and corporate figures from the pre-war period, who fled underground and see themselves as the legitimate continuation of the United States government. This is, in a nutshell, the continuity of government initiatives from our own reality. Originally developed as an assurance against a nuclear strike, the continuity of government plan began as a push for every American to have access to a shelter from nuclear attack. A noble goal, if not for the fact that the US caused these problems to start with. But don't worry, that noble goal will completely go away, because thanks to the influence of military contractors and their symbionts in the executive branch of the state, this was all whittled down to just a single plan: the evacuation of the nation's elite leaders to bunkers hidden under mountains. The idea was that someone from the executive would survive no matter what happens. And, for this purpose, who was in the bunkers rotated. In fact, this system has been brought back in the wake of 9/11, and if you've heard that Dick Cheney was in a bunker for much of the war on terror, this is what people are referring to. No matter what eventually occurred, thanks to the warmongering of Cheney and Bush, the plan and the man would survive. And with him, the United States government and Halliburton would live on. For any Americans who are watching, if you read half the shit that I read for this video, you will realize very quickly why the rest of the world does not in fact think that you live in the greatest country in the world, and why freedom for the United States means annihilation of everywhere else. As the old quote from Tacitus once said about the Roman Empire, they make a desert and they call it peace.
The US spent $640 billion on weapons in 2013 alone. It's also the #1 exporter of weapons to the world. Weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon are some of the biggest profiteers in the ongoing so-called war on terror.
Okay, with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, these nuclear neoconservatives finally assumed control of US nuclear strategy, budgets, and launch codes. The public would soon be blindsided by their hawkish views. Those who'd been reading their manifestos in journals like Foreign Policy were not so surprised. Hans Morgenthau warned as early as 1976 that Teller and the company were trying to conventionalize nuclear war out of ignorance about the objective conditions under which nuclear weapons force us to live. They came to power tossing around basketball terms like a full-court press. Top Reagan officials declared nuclear war to be imaginable and winnable. You could fill an entire book with the strange Lavian rhetoric of the first 2 years of Reagan's term. In fact, Robert Scheer did just that in his contemporary 1983 account, With Enough Shovels, Reagan, Bush, and Nuclear War. The title of the book refers to an interview Scheer conducted with Reagan's Deputy Secretary of Defense for Strategic and Theater Nuclear Forces, a former burying project manager named T.K. Jones.
If there are enough shovels to go around, everyone's going to make it,
Jones told Scheer. Dig a hole, cover it with a couple of doors, and then throw 3 feet of dirt on top. It's the dirt that does it. T.K. Jones's breathtakingly idiotic ideas about nuclear war did not stop with civil defense. He also believed America would recover from a nuclear war within a few years. The idea that the US could bounce back from a nuclear exchange was actually quite widespread in Reagan's Washington. Reagan's FEMA distributed leaflets to municipal governments stating, "With reasonable protective measures, the United States could survive nuclear attack and go on to recovery within a relatively few years." His appointee to the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency described nuclear war as a destructive thing, but still in large part a physics problem, possible for any society to survive. In the spring of 1982, Reagan personally proposed the $4 billion civil defense plan for evacuating major cities and housing refugees in above-ground rural shelters. Local officials across the country from Matt Koch down scoffed at claims the plan would save 80% of the US population. It was as if nobody in government knew that modern thermonuclear weapons made the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs look like firecrackers by comparison. Senior officials publicly discussed plans to execute and survive a nuclear conflict, involving hundreds, if not thousands, of these warheads. When Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger appeared before the House Budget Committee, he described the goal of ballooning Pentagon budgets as expanding the US capability for deterring or prosecuting a global war with the Soviet Union. Richard Pipes, the The guy's name's fucking Dick Pipes, Jesus Christ. Richard Pipes, the senior Sovietologist on Reagan's national security staff, criticized those who question the notions of victory and defeat in a nuclear exchange. In April of 1982, 2 months before 1 million people gathered in Central Park to protest Reagan's policies, Pipes put the current probability of nuclear war at 40%. About this looming prospect, Reagan's Secretary of Energy said, "I want to come out of it number 1, not 2. The Fallout TV show came out in 2024 and takes place after the majority of the events in the video game series. Once again, the series follows a Vault Dweller, Lucy McLean, played by the same actress that played the lead soccer player turned human barbecue in Yellow Jackets. Also, now you can light a fire. This show introduces a new audience to Fallout's history and present, through the use of flashbacks to the months, to the weeks, to the seconds before the bombs fall. And it is there that we get our most overt parallels to real-world events, and the points where the line between military corporations and the American government completely disappeared, right when that was the worst possible outcome. Of course, you can't separate the state with its monopoly on the use of violence, but with the profit motive being the principal guiding force behind America's war machine, rather the interest of the people who, don't tend to be down with the idea of being eviscerated by nuclear fire, even the evils of state were amplified, and twisted into their most threatening form to date. Without Bush, Vannevar that is, not George or George, would we have nuclear stockpiles? Well, probably. The technology and science was there to make that final push, but the conditions that led to the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after Japan's surrender no less, and the nuclear arms race that followed, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and more, those are all events arguably birthed from the need to profiteer, to demonstrate superiority of arms, to sell weapons and fear both to the world. But the American state is set up the way that it is. So if it wasn't Bush and Raytheon, it wouldn't be long until another figure popped up, like they do every generation. Your Dick Cheneys, your Donald Rumsfelds, your Eric Princes. The military-industrial complex was in a way inevitable, as long as the United States' primary guiding principle remained the profit motive. Anyway, I'm sure everything's fine today, and we've all actually learned our lesson. Don't check the news. Iran? No thanks. I'll sit. Israel? No, I'm gonna pretend it's not. I think a lot of Americans and people around the world like to see the private companies that do all of the arms sales and all that as bad actors that the state needs to rein in. But the truth is that they are inseparable. The American state and the American war machine are symbiotic. One cannot exist without the other, and the legitimacy of both of them in the minds of much of the public depends on both parties pretending that they are entirely separate, even opposed. From the Military-Industrial Complex and the New Industrial State by Walter Adams. The giant corporations achieve such dominance of American industry that it can control its environment and immunize itself in the discipline of all exogenous control mechanisms, especially the competitive market. Through separation of ownership from management, it has emancipated itself from the control of stockholders. By reinvestment of profits, it has eliminated the influence of the financier and the capital market. By brainwashing its clientele, it has insulated itself from consumer sovereignty. By possession of market power, it has come to dominate both suppliers and customers. By judicious identification with and manipulation of the state, it has achieved autonomy from government control. Whatever it cannot do for itself to assure survival and growth, a compliant government does on its behalf, assuring the maintenance of full employment, eliminating the risk of and subsidizing the investment in research and development, and assuring the supply of scientific and technical skills required by the modern technostructure. In return for this privileged autonomy, the industrial giant performs society's planning function. Must society legitimize a self-sustaining, self-serving, self-justifying, and self-perpetuating industrial oligarchy as the price for efficiency and progress? Here, government not only permits and facilitates the entrenchment of private power, but sets at its fountainhead. It creates and institutionalizes power concentrations which tend to breed on themselves and to defy public control. The scenario of events should be familiar. The mad momentum of an international weapons race militates towards large defense expenditures. This generates a demand, not only for traditional commercial shelf items like food, clothing, fuel, and ammunition, but also for the development and production of sophisticated weaponry. Lacking a network of government-owned arsenals, such as produced the shot and cannon in the days of American innocence, having dismantled the arsenals it did have, the government is forced to buy what it can no longer make. It becomes a monopolistic buyer of products which are not yet designed or for which production experience is lacking. It buys at prices for which there is little precedent and hardly any yardsticks. It deals with the contractors, a large percentage of whose business is often to supply defense, space, or atomic energy needs. It confronts powerful oligopolists in a market where technical capability rather than price is the controlling variable, in an atmosphere shrouded by multilateral uncertainty and constant warnings about imminent aggression. In the process, government becomes almost totally dependent on the chosen instruments, i.e. creatures of its own making, for effectuating public policy. Lacking any viable in-house capabilities, competitive yardsticks, or the potential for institutional competition, the government becomes, in the extreme, subservient to the private and special interests, whose entrenched power bears the government seal. This unique buyer-seller relationship, which denies analysis by conventional economic tools, lies at the root of the military-industrial complex and the new power configurations generated by it. The complex is not a conspiracy between the merchants of death and a band of lusty generals, but a natural coalition of interest groups with an economic, political, or professional stake in defense and space. It includes the armed services, the industrial contractors who produce for them, the labor unions that represent their workers, the lobbyists who tout their wares in the name of free enterprise and national security, and the legislators who, for reasons of pork or patriotism, vote the sizable funds to underwrite the show. Every time the Congress authorizes a military appropriation, it creates a new constituency, with a vested interest in its perpetuation and aggrandizement. Thus, the current proposal for an anti-ballistic missile system, the thin variety of which would cost $5 billion, and the thick variety, $40 million, and which would probably be obsolete by the time it's completed, has been estimated to involve 28 private contractors, with plants located in 42 states, i.e. 84 senators, and 172 congressional districts. So, spoilers for the Fallout show, but this is the history and the American politics that the show, and the franchise as a whole, is dealing with. The American state outsourced the survival of humanity, to quote the show itself, to those whose prime directive is profit. Peace is bad for business. In fact, when a peace settlement looks like it might be reached, Voltaire and its partners panic and determine that they must ensure conflict continues at any cost. The world itself might end, but Voltec will survive, because they've built the only things that possibly can. They've won, they've outcompeted everything else. And they plan to outlast a world without profits. And once that's over, begin a new age of colonialism, a new frontier, Terra Nullius, a capitalist's wet dream.
Fun idea. There's a lot of earning potential with the end of the world. But we're talking about making a significant investment based on a hypothetical. How can you guarantee results?
Fallout 2024 is everything I've ever wanted out of a Fallout adaptation. The 50s feel, the factional conflicts and the horrors of the past that made them at the front and center, the themes, the characters, the humor, the convergence between over-the-top gore, stupid jokes, and genuinely heart-wrenching intense political intrigue that Fallout as a series does so well. The themes of finding hope and community in a heartless world that's actively killing you with enemies around every corner. The dark facets of America that made the wasteland inevitable. Ugh, it's perfect. Now, I know a lot of people don't agree, and I'm not talking about the people that decided Fallout had gone woke because Lucy didn't have a BBL and fixed the announcement poster by photoshopping her butt. And admittedly, I've not played the first two Fallout games beyond a couple of minutes, though I do plan to change that since I've owned them for years, and the fact that they're still untouched is honestly a crime. Anyway, because of that, I'm not as bothered about any messing with canon that was done in the show. And I know that a lot of people don't like the fleshing out of the pre-Wasteland history because it ultimately doesn't matter who dropped the bomb first. The result was the same. I get that. But I love it. Plus, it leans into one of the major theories that have been going around for years now, and something that was heavily hinted in Fallout 4 as well.
It's a matter of utmost urgency, I assure you.
What's so important?
Why, nothing less than your entire future. If you haven't noticed, ma'am, this country has gone to heck in a handbasket. If you'll excuse my language, the big kaboom is... it's inevitable. I'm afraid. And coming sooner than you may think. If you catch my meaning.
I don't care if he was reading from a script. That Vault-Tec rep did seem pretty certain what was coming. And there's a reason they wanted to freeze your soldier husband for centuries, ready to recolonize the surface. You can argue amongst yourself in the comments, but I think this was a necessary step for an audience that never played the games to understand the world. And it connected the world so cleanly to our own, in a way that feels absurd, but is, tragically, rooted in real history. Even if it is, literally, current-day California shit. In the pre-Wasteland plotline, Cooper's drinking with his friend and co-star Charles Whiteknife in a bar, who is trying to convince him to attend the Hollywood communist meetings he's been going to. And he says this line, which is 100% on the money, and in our modern context, both in terms of warmongering by arms companies and how fossil fuel giants have profited their way into causing apocalypse by another means, demonstrates in one tragic argument how capitalism inevitably leads to apocalypse.
So the U.S. government has outsourced the survival of the human race to Vault-Tec. Vault-Tec is a private corporation that has a fiduciary responsibility to make money for its investors. And how does it make money? By selling vaults.
That's called capitalism, Charlie.
But they can't sell vaults if these peace negotiations go through. So Vault-Tec has a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that it don't work out.
Yeah, how are they going to do that?
In this case, real life is even wackier than the satire you're watching. It is illegal under United States law to operate a business at a loss. If you're a military contractor, this means that efforts towards peace are not only counter to your aims, but could make you a criminal. To deliberately step away from profiteering is a breach of fiduciary duty. This is framed as ensuring that no one person can put their needs above the needs of a company. In practice, however, it is a guarantee that the engine that powers the capitalist death cult continues apace. Profits can only go up, at any cost. Whether it be from nuclear weapons or climate breakdown, capitalism again and again creates the conditions for humanity's destruction. This is no accident. This is the system working as intended. ExxonMobil and other oil companies have known the effects of climate change that they were causing decades before everyone else. They did the studies, and then they kept it quiet. When the science became too obvious, they sent propagandists throughout the media to deny it, and when they could no longer do that convincingly, they changed their tune, and they sent propagandists to argue that climate change won't be as bad as they know it will be. And they know, because they did the studies that warned us of our coming potential end first. Only a few decades after the Cuban Missile Crisis, once again, capitalism pushes humanity to a knife's edge. And while most of us run for cover and scream in fear, a few fat cats at the top make a tidy profit, and then watch the world from their bunker as the proverbial mushroom cloud blooms on the horizon. And while the success of Vault-Tec's plan for a complete global monopoly is obviously drastic, the real-life plans of the military-industrial complex would have ended very much the same. With the Cold War over, the stage was set for complete global domination by the United States of America, and much like in Fallout, in real history, the goal was an American monopoly. And just like in Fallout, this meant nuclear attacks on China, and even on unarmed countries. And it's not like this is some conspiracy theory that I'm just pulling out of my ass. They wrote this down. You can look it up. The continuity of government crowd, with Dick Cheney and the rest of the neocons that rose of the Reagan era and have dominated American politics ever since, were very, very clear about their aims. And as history unfolded, those aims would start to be fulfilled. First by the Gulf War, then the War on Terror, and even now, the US seeks to stoke a new Cold War with China. The Vault-Tec conspiracy is bananas, but it isn't far from reality. And that reality's name was the Project for a New American Century.
Let me start at the beginning, I guess. There's a paper written called Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategies, Forces and Resources for a New Century, the Project for a New American Century, September 2000. Now, this was first mooted in the early 90s, and what it says is America's going to be the new superpower, take over the whole world militarily, totally dominate the world. And I can't tell you how I feel about that. I mean, how dare they? America's only 5% of the world's population, and the rest of us are us. And we don't want you anywhere near us. We don't want your McDonald's, your Starbucks, any of that garbage. We want to be able to live in peace with our own culture and our own creativity, and we don't want to be dominated by anyone, let alone militarily. Anyway, this was written by the right-wing neocons, for the right-wing neocons, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Freeth, Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, and the whole mob. And when it was first mooted in the 1990s, they said that they would use whatever military force necessary, and I thought they won't do that. That's just silly, whistling in the wind. And I suppose people felt like that when they read Mein Kampf. I don't want anyone to get offended with what I say. I want you to stick with me. Don't walk out. And then they rewrote it in 1998 and then in the year 2000. And indeed, what they say is they will use nuclear weapons on any country they so desire. Libya, I mean really big countries. Libya, Syria, Cuba, North Korea. But eventually they're setting up China to be the new Cold War enemy, and I'll get into that in a minute, but that's all described in this book. The Pentagon is writing about it. They're ringing China with military bases because clearly they need the business, because war is good for business. Then they write about Star Wars. America's going to dominate space, which happens to be a global commons, and they're going to militarize space and put orbiting nuclear reactors, orbiting laser beam weapons, orbiting particle beam weapons, anti-satellite weapons, and they're going to dominate space, although it belongs to all of us. So when you read this, you understand what's going on. Without reading this, you won't actually know what the overall plan of these people in the White House is. And they're systematically proceeding to fulfill their plan.
I've mentioned that Dick Cheney was part of the Project for a New American Century several times in this video already, but you'll recognise many of his colleagues too. The PNAC, ostensibly a think tank establishing the ideology of the growing neoconservative movement, regrouping following the end of the Cold War and the embrace of Reaganite neoliberalism by the Democratic Party, was tasked with determining the future of conservatism in the United States, in a world that they had already won. 25 people signed the PNAC's horrifying founding document, its statement of principles, including Dick Cheney, of course, but also Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, who you might recognise as key figures in the George W. Bush administration, the team behind the War on Terror, and the end of the short-lived end of history. In truth, history never truly ends. Every end is also a beginning. This is something the Fallout series teaches well. After the bombs, humanity doesn't give up, it regroups. But this doesn't just mean people are coming together to help each other. Much like in Fallout, the very forces that ended the previous world order return to ensure that their victory remains permanent and inescapable. In this way, you can think of the destruction of Shady Sands and the crippling of the New California Republic by the remains of Vault-Tec as a war on terror. The Cold War is over. There is no alternative to the American way. None other can control the levers of power. No alternative can be allowed to exist. As the statement of principles for the Project for a New American Century reads, as the 20th century draws to a close, the United States stands as the world's preeminent power. Having led the West to victory in the Cold War, America faces an opportunity and a challenge. Does the United States have the vision to build upon the achievements of past decades? Does the United States have the resolve to shape a new century favorable to American principles and interests? We seem to have forgotten the essential elements of the Reagan administration's success. A military that is strong and ready to meet both present and future challenges. A foreign policy that boldly and purposefully promotes American principles abroad. A national leadership that accepts the United States' global responsibilities. Of course, the United States must be prudent in how it exercises its power. We cannot safely avoid the responsibilities of global leadership or the causes that are associated with its exercise. America has a vital role in maintaining peace and security in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. If we shirk our responsibilities, we invite challenges to our fundamental interests. The history of the 20th century should have taught us that it is important to shape circumstances before crises emerge, and to meet threats before they become dire. The history of this century should have taught us to embrace the cause of American leadership.
You have a military-industrial complex. They do like war. You know, in Syria with the caliphate. So I wipe out 100% of the caliphate. That doesn't mean you're not going to have these crazy people going around blowing up stores and blowing up things. These are seriously ill people. I don't want to say, oh, they're wiped out, you know, ISIS. But I wiped out 100% of the caliphate. I said, I want to bring our troops back home. The place went crazy. They want to keep, you have people here in Washington. They never want to leave. I said, you know what I'll do? I'll leave a couple of hundred soldiers behind. But if it was up to them, they'd bring thousands of soldiers in.
And thus the plans were made. Plans to once again light a fire under the military-industrial complex. To get the engines of war moving onwards and upwards, expanding forever, profiting forever. Iraq was a primary target for PNAC's goals, control of the movement of oil throughout the world was essential, as was stoking a new arms race with China, and of course, because we're talking about Fallout here, I can't avoid talking about the plans to use nuclear weapons, both against nuclear-armed countries and those without that power. A new century was coming, and though America had no great enemy left to fight it would. Forever. Finding new enemies wherever the opportunity struck. It was not enough for America to be emperors of the world. They had to grow, to expand, into space, into neutral countries, into every corner of the world. Because what is profit without growth? Like the empires of old they model themselves after, America would do as Tacitus wrote down all those thousands of years ago. They would make a desert and call it peace. Or rather, they would make a wasteland and call it freedom. When neoconservatives William Crystal and Robert Kagan formed PNAC in 1997, they aimed to set forth a new agenda for post-Cold War foreign and military policy that would ensure the United States could claim the 21st century as its own, where US military dominance would not only protect US national security and national interests, but also establish a global Pax Americana. The election of George W. Bush opened the door to the Pentagon, Vice President's Office, State Department, and the National Security Council for PNAC associates, many of whom included Richard Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Douglas Feith, and Paul Wolfowitz, being the leading figures in the Bush administration's foreign policy team. Although not all were neoconservatives themselves, the PNAC associates brought neoconservative ideology and a common conviction of US supremacy with them into government. However, it is not until September the 11th the PNAC-dominated foreign policy team got its chance to fast-forward their plans to remake the world as a US dominion. And, as with any large operation, there will be people working under this system that try to separate themselves from it. There are some parallels I can't stop thinking about between a certain historical figure recently getting his time in the sun and a character in the Fallout show. The former scientist who leads the communist meetings in the show's flashbacks after Vault-Tec bought out her cold fusion technology and stuck a patent on it, keeping it from being used for the public good rather than profit. Moldaver, as she is known in the Wasteland, worked on nuclear energy breakthroughs under the Fallout world's military-industrial complex, and radicalized after something she made that could work wonders for the public good was stolen from her and monopolized by the American war machine. Now, you might ask, with all we've talked about today, and with what we know about the exaggerated hyper-capitalist Cold War hysteria of the Fallout world, what did she expect? And as a former scientist, I can tell you, a lot of scientists truly earnestly believe that they exist outside of politics, in a world of objective truth, in a pocket dimension outside of the world that the rest of us live in. In this way, she reminds me of one of the most fascinating historical figures to come out of the very birth of the military-industrial complex in the real world, working alongside Raytheon's very own Vannevar Bush for the Manhattan Project, and a man who was almost certainly a communist, and yet undoubtedly contributed heavily to the development of the American war machine, which worked to crush his ideology and the entire world underneath its boot. J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was not a good man. He helped pick the targets for the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to this day the only nuclear bombs used on civilian centers, used against a nation that had already surrendered. He had the tools, the smarts, and the intellectual frameworks to know exactly what he was doing. And yes, by all accounts, he had a lot of regrets, and tried in vain to advocate against a nuclear stockpile and a nuclear arms race. But he did do it. He, as he said in real life to the President of the United States, had blood in his hands. To which, as an aside, the President in real life called him a pussy and said, "Blood in his hands, damn it! He hasn't half as much blood in his hands as I have. You don't just go around bellyaching about it. I don't want to see that son of a bitch in this office ever again." And in this way, Moldaver, though obviously a morally grey character, is if anything less cartoonish than Oppenheimer, apart from the whole living to be 250 years old thing. She developed wonders of science that were immediately claimed and locked away by the American war machine, and she decided to fight, while Oppenheimer instead continued to work for the men for whom he had become death, destroyer of worlds. Indeed, Moldaver's greyness, from what we know, comes after the company who stole her world-saving technology hoarded it and then set off the events that ended the world. And in her situation, I think I'd probably be a little unhinged too. Plus, she's a lesbian communist scientist and a complete badass, so I am a lot biased. Speaking of Moldaver, with her story we come to how I want to round off this admittedly very depressing topic. Because one of the major themes of Fallout, despite everything, is hope at the end of the world. The attempts to rebuild, even when it looks hopeless and the world seems cartoonishly hostile. And at the end of her journey in the show, just as things are looking ridiculously bleak, and all hope seems lost, she turns to Maximus, the Brotherhood of Steel initiate we've been following all season long, and his friend who is, of course, fucking pronouns, fucking gender ambiguity, and entrusts him with the future. Or, as some people might say, entrusts him with current day California shit. Not because she's made a careful choice, but because she has to. He's there, and her cold fusion device has finally been activated, only to be taken by the Brotherhood of Steel. As she lies bleeding, the Brotherhood storming her base, she implores the only person she can, Maximus, to consider how the Brotherhood will use the technology she pioneered. And in doing this, despite all the shit she's seen, despite how jaded she is, despite how broken she is by all of these events, she entrusts the future, not just of her technology, but of the entire world, to a stranger. Because after everything she's been through, after her world ended, not once, but twice, she has not lost hope. The America she knew ended. The new California Republic she knew ended. She watched the people who stole her life's work wipe out humanity time and time again. But she's lived for a long time, and she knows that the end is not the end. And I implore you to remember the same thing. As much as people insist that there is no alternative, as much as it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, there is a world beyond capitalism. The end of the world isn't always the end of the world. And that's one of the strangely hopeful things about Fallout. Even after nuclear Armageddon, after the Earth has suffered as totally and completely as it is possible to do, after all the worst nightmares of mankind have come true, there is still hope. And there are still people working to rebuild, to be better than the horrors that came before. Our fate is not yet sealed, is never completely sealed. And even those whose fate is, will, with any luck, see another day. A resurgence. We can break this cycle. This spiral of war and profit that keeps the American military spinning like a hurricane, ripping across the world. War never changes? That's not a fact. It's a request from those who sit on the boards of Raytheon, Blackwater, Halliburton, and Voltec. And for the sake of preventing a wasteland of our own, I humbly suggest that we decline. Thanks for watching.
I wake up in the morning and I wonder why everything's the same as it was. I can't understand, no, I can't understand how life goes on the way it does. does my heart go on beating? Why do these eyes of mine cry? Don't they know it's the end of the world? It ended when you said goodbye.
Hey there, thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. If you like this video and you want to do well, I think you do. I think you do. Have you not thought about that? Well, if you have, like it, leave a comment, subscribe, and most importantly, tell your friends about it. Also, I am unfortunately quite poor right now, so if you have a few coins burning a hole in your pocket, you hate to see a tran like me down on her luck, why not help me get out of my massive, horrifying overdraft and send me some money? You can give me one-time donations on Ko-fi or PayPal, links below as always, or better yet, send it to my Patreon, where you get early videos, access to the members-only Discord, my Nintendo Switch friend code, and exclusive content, such as long-form interviews with Princess Weeks, Rosencreutz, and Jessie Gender. In addition to all of that good stuff, you'll also, if you sign up, get your name read out at the end of each video, just like these lovely people. Vince Whitaker, Amelia Unchained, Sarah Rudston, Jason Haig, Frank McManus, Susan Foster, Helena, Sierra Whiskey, Arestria, Ali Catgirl, Brian, John N, Scully, Jan, Lloyd Luciente, Jason Cribbett, Shield Vaden, Robin Podolsky, Exploding Turtle, Casual Observer, Terry Roberts, Manta Ray, Courtney Burmack, Sleepy Slug, Philippa Tabrogga, Soma Piglet, Brain Douche, Artie Wolf, Hayden Gayler, Greg Noble, Deanna McMillan, Caroline Regalado, Alexandra Lilly, PJ Lisbrell, Howard Lott, Narania, Scarjan, and Joey Cobalt.